Our scripture reading today comes from Luke chapter 15, verses 11 to 32. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger son spoke to his father. He said, 'Father, give me my share of the family property.' So the father divided his property between his 2 sons. Not long after that, the younger son packed up all he had. Then he left for a country far away. There he wasted his money on wild living. He spent everything he had. Then the whole country ran low on food, so the son didn't have what he needed. He went to work for someone who lived in that country. That person sent the son to the fields to feed the pigs. The son wanted to fill his stomach with the food the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. Then he began to think clearly again. He said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough food? But here I am dying from hunger. I will get up and go back to my father. I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven, and I have sinned against you. I'm no longer fit to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. While the son was still a long way off, his father saw him. He was filled with tender love for his son. He ran to him. He threw his arms around him and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer fit to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattest calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. This son of mine was dead, and now he is alive again. He was lost, and now he is found.' So they began to celebrate. The older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants. He asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come home,' the servant replied. 'Your father has killed the fattest calf. He has done this because your brother is back, safe and sound.' The older brother became angry. He refused to go in. So his father went out and begged him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've worked like a slave for you. I've always obeyed your orders. You never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But this son of yours wasted your money with some prostitutes. Now he comes home, and for him you kill the fattest calf?' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me. Everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad. This brother of yours was dead, and now he is alive again. He was lost, and now he is found.'"
We've just heard one of the most famous stories in the Bible, the story about a father, his 2 sons, and their home. Now, the story begins with the younger son, and he wants to have complete independence from his father. And so he goes to the extreme of asking his father, who's still living, for his inheritance now. He doesn't want to wait till his father dies. He wants it now. He just wants to leave and be on his own. In a way, it's like telling his father, "You're as good as dead to me. I don't want to be with you anymore. Just give me what I have coming to me and let me be." Now, in our story, this request was granted by the father, and the son takes all his money and he goes far away to do his own thing. Now, this story, which is taught to us by Jesus, is a special kind of story. It's called a parable, and Jesus often taught in parables. And parables are like stories within a story. It's where the story has a deeper meaning to teach us something about ourselves and God. Now, in this parable, in this story, each of the characters represents somebody else. Now, in this one, the father is God. it's Jesus. And we'll use those terms interchangeably in this message because God and Jesus are really one and the same. Jesus is God the Son. Now notice something interesting here as we just start to scratch the surface of this story, that the Father honored the request of the younger son to go off on his own. And I think that's an important thing for us as we're talking about our relationship with God. God does not force anyone to, quote unquote, stay home. There are no locks on the doors in God's house. Now, God has made us for a purpose, that we might be in a relationship with him and that we might know him and know his love for us and love him in return. God has made us for that, but he doesn't force that upon anyone. So if the Father is God, Jesus, well then who is the younger son? The younger son is anyone who wants to live life on their own terms. People who want to live life on their own terms. These we might describe as people who are not interested in God. People who don't like to be told what to do. They don't really want to live according to God's commands and God's rules and God's ways. Now, certainly there are many people in the world who would fit into this category. And I'm wondering if maybe you can identify with this younger son. Maybe you grew up in a home where no one really believed in God or talked about God. So maybe you've just never really had a lot of interest in God. And you think maybe whenever the few times you think about God, it's like, well, I guess he's there, but he's not really a part of my daily life. I don't make my decisions based on what I think God would want me to do or the lifestyle I choose to live. Or maybe you did grow up in a home, a Christian home where the Bible was taught and you went to church, but then you got older and you went to college or you moved out and you just started to move away and drift away from God and you've never really come back. So I wonder if there's some people who could really identify with this younger son. Well, let's find out what happened to him. Now, at the beginning, once he left, it went great for him. He got his money, he ran, and he did exactly what he wanted to do. He took in everything the world had to offer. And the Bible says he just kind of this wild lifestyle. He was very reckless. He said yes to everything he wanted, every desire. Imagine, every day was a yes day for him. And there were absolutely no limits. There was no looking back. He was just living exactly life as he wanted it. But after a while, after he'd spent some time away from home, he discovered that it wasn't all that he thought it was going to be. In fact, things start to fall apart. We read in the story that Jesus told that he eventually went through all of his money. He burned through it all. And after that, a famine hit the country. And he had nothing left, so he didn't even have money to buy food. So he's poor, he's probably homeless, hungry, and he does what he can to survive, right? So he gets a job feeding pigs. It's like the lowest of the lowest, sloppy, disgusting jobs you can get. He's taking care of pigs. And he's so bad that he actually envies the pigs, that the food that they have. It's that bad that he's actually like, man, these pigs have it better than I do. And we see that none of his new friends that he'd spent all his money with, no one was there to help him. In fact, the text says no one gave him anything. He was far from home and lost. And he's left feeling humiliated, neglected, and insignificant. So we take a step away from the story. I think how many times have we heard this story, but kind of like in our own time? The story of a person who just, they did what they wanted to do. They lived on their own terms. They turned aside the counsel of friends and family, and they just ended up destroying their life, whether it was a marriage or a career, a family, led into addictions, whatever it might be, just kind of absolutely destroyed their life. And maybe that was you. Maybe that's your story. And you're like, yes, I know what it's like to be in that pig pen. Or maybe you knew someone or someone in your family or a friend who you knew took that path. And you've seen just the destruction that can happen. You know, despite what is often said or often preached in popular culture, experience shows us that living life on your own terms and doing whatever you want is not the road to happiness. It's not the road to happiness, often leading to destruction. Now, to be fair, it doesn't always end in disaster when people just kind of go out and do their own thing and live far from God. Not everyone lands in the pig pen. In fact, some are quite successful in terms of the world. But I still think it's fair to say it's not always what it seems. In fact, I don't think it is ever what it seems. You know, think of all the stories about celebrities and just how their personal lives are, they're in counseling and their just lives are empty and filled with all kinds of chaos. It's really like kind of become like almost a cliche of how corrupt and miserable and out of control the lives of, famous, wealthy people are. And it makes you wonder, how come? How come that's become a cliche when they got everything they wanted and they're on top of the world? A number of years ago, there was a famous interview done with Tom Brady on 60 Minutes. And it was really kind of this haunting interview because here's Tom Brady, one of the most famous athletes in the world. He's worth an insane amount of money, millions and millions and millions of dollars. He's married to one of the world's most famous supermodels. He won just a bunch of Super Bowls, more than anyone else ever has. He's considered the greatest quarterback of all time. And yet, in the interview, he expresses this like emptiness inside, this searching, this longing that he kind of still hasn't found what he's looking for. And it's strange that of all people in all the world, this handsome, wealthy, super accomplished athlete would be still searching for something. Many years ago, there was a man who lived, and he was just brilliant, and he was really ambitious, and was living kind of a life trying to fulfill all his pleasures and desires, and he was after the very, very best of what the world could give. And he lived that way for a while and was incredibly unhappy. And no matter what success he'd gotten, he just felt like life was still lacking. His name was Augustine, and he lived during the days of the Roman Empire. And after quite a bit of searching, he ends up becoming a Christian. And when he does that, he finds out all the things that he's been looking for out in the world. Like, he finally found satisfaction in God. And so he's got this famous quote, and he says, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in you." You see, you and I, we were made for God, or as we want to maybe say in terms of this story, we were made for home. We were made for life at home with the Father. And when we're not there, there's a sickness in our hearts. There's like a famine within. There's something inside that's missing. And I think this explains the Tom Brady thing and the celebrity thing and Augustine searching and that universal experience we as humans share, this universal longing for purpose and meaning and acceptance and significance and contentment and identity. It's why we're all searching. Well, let's get back to our story. This young guy after some time, it says he came to himself. So he kind of like, he got his mind in a good place. He got into a good headspace. He moves past this fierce independent streak he had, and he realizes, I've made a mistake. I made a huge mistake. I never should have left home. So he forms a plan that he's going to go back home. But he realizes, I can't just waltz in through the front door. I wished my father dead. I blew through my inheritance. I've got nothing to show for it. He's wasted it all. And he has no longer, if you think about it, a claim to even sonship, because he's already sworn off his father as dead. And he's like, you're dead to me. And so he says, my father's servants, they have it better than I do living here in this pig pen. So he's like, I'm going to go back and just hopefully out of his goodness of his heart, he'll take me back as a servant. But in his heart, he's thinking I can't go back as a son. And so who does this guy represent? Now who does this son represent? Well, he's the person who says, I'm too far gone. I'm too far gone for God. I'm too far gone. I mean, have you ever felt like that? Too far gone? And maybe with a relationship, a family member, or somebody you used to date or even be married to, and you're at a place where I can never talk to that person again. Man, I've burned my bridges. There's nothing left there. It didn't end well. I can't go back to that person or back to that place. Well, I wonder if maybe you've ever felt that way about God. I know when I used to be a chaplain in the Army, and we would have chapel services, and I'd always go around and invite guys to come to our worship services. And it wasn't uncommon for me to be like, oh, chaplain, if you only knew what I did, you would never invite me. And they'd always joke about how if they ever showed up at a chapel service, that God would strike the building with lightning, or an earthquake would come and suck everybody down. And I think in their kind of joking, what they were really saying is if you knew me, if you knew the real me, if you knew what I'd done, what I'm doing now, if you knew what I've thought, how I've treated people, if you knew all the hidden stuff, if you knew all my secrets, then you would know that God wouldn't accept me. And there's no purpose in your invitation. And I think there's something to that, if we can be honest. The original version of the story was this. Because this story existed before Jesus. It was a story about this, son who went away and blew all the father's money in wild, reckless living, realized he'd made a mistake, and then he came home. And in the original version of the story, when he gets home, the father throws him out on his ear, and it was nope, you're dead to me too, and you've got no place here, and he's rejected him. And that was really kind of a story of warning young kids about, going too far away from home too fast. But Jesus changes the trajectory of the story. So when he's telling this story, everybody's like, okay, yep, I know where this is going. I know what's going to happen. The son comes home. And then Jesus changes it. And when he changes it, he teaches us what he is really like. And in Jesus' version of the story, while this young son is still far away off, his father sees him. It's as if he's scanning the horizon. And he felt compassion for him. His heart just broke for his son. And he runs to him and he embraces him and he kisses him, even though he still smells like the pig pen, covered in the slop of the world. Now, the wayward son in our text, he begins to recite his speech, but he can't even really get through the first line before his father interrupts him, and he puts his best robe on him. He puts the ring on his hand, which was like the family signet, and he put shoes on his feet. Now, the guy's so poor, he doesn't even have shoes, and it was slaves and prisoners who were barefoot, but never a son. And he puts him in the family best, and they call for the calf, the fatted calf, which is saved for the very most special celebration. And he says, slaughter the fatted calf. We're going to have a feast. We are going to celebrate. Now, what's important to note here is what they were celebrating is not what the son had done. The father wasn't excited at celebrating that. They were celebrating that he was home. They were celebrating that he had come home. And the father says, "This is my son. He was lost. Now he's found. He was dead. Now he was alive." Almost as if he was dead to me, but he's come home and our relationship is alive. And Jesus is teaching us here something very directly. If you want to know what my heart is like, this is it. I'm the dad in this story who goes running across the fields with open arms, ready to embrace and receive. Now, we need to hit a pause button on this story as we're talking about the story and who Jesus is, because a surface reading of this might lend us to kind of think of like, well, Jesus, he's a nice guy. And Jesus is like always about second chances, and he's just really forgiving. And those things are true. But we're missing a big part of this story as it relates to Jesus. That acceptance comes at a cost. It comes at a great cost. Jesus does not just say, hey, don't worry about it. We'll sweep everything under the carpet and we're good to go. That's not how it works. You see, when we're in our relationship to God, we have sin, and those are the things that we think, say, and do that go against God. And the Bible is very clear that sin separates us from God. And in order to bridge that gap, in order to remove the stain of sin, or we might think of the smell of the slop and the pigs in our life, God had to do something. It costs him a lot to welcome us back. There was a debt that had to be paid. And Jesus did that when he went to the cross and he died for us. He opened up the way for us to come back home when he died. And the invitation of Jesus, the invitation of the gospel is this, is that by faith, God can welcome us home. By the gracious action of Jesus Christ on the cross, that simply by faith, by turning our hearts towards God and moving towards God, we will be accepted and loved and forgiven and embraced into God's family. Not because of anything we've done, but because of what Jesus has done. And that's why we're here as a church. That's why we worship every week. That's why we sing songs about him. That's why we try to live our lives a certain way, as if God has really done this and that he's really welcomed us home. You know, like we would imagine that the son, when he came back and he was welcomed by the father, he didn't repeat the mistakes he made, but he lived a different kind of life. And in realizing the love and the care of the Father that he hadn't previously. And that's what we're all about. And today, that is the kind of life that I would love to invite you into, to receive that wonderful love of our Father and of Jesus. But the story doesn't end there. There's another brother, and he's not as gracious as the father. He's out in the fields. He hears a big celebration. He hears what's going on, and he refuses to go in. He refuses to go home. He's angry about like this whole thing. He can't believe that they're throwing a party for this brother who's been just so like rude and reckless. And so this older brother, he says to his dad, he goes, like, what are you doing? Like, I have served you. I have obeyed you, and you haven't given me anything, not even like a little goat, no less the fatted calf. You've never given me anything. And we can hear resentment in his voice, right? We can hear like pent up anger and frustration. Like, I've been doing all the right stuff and you haven't, shown me anything or given me anything. And what is revealed here is that there is a distance between that older son in his father. Because he was working hard, he was doing all the right stuff, and even though this older son had never left home, in some ways he was just as far away as his brother had been, certainly from his father's heart. So who does this older brother represent? We'll call this third group the so close and yet so far. These are the so close and yet so far. Now, when Jesus was first telling this story, it represented the Pharisees, who were the religious leaders of the day, and they followed every rule in the book. They even made up their own books so they could add more rules, because they wanted to show how serious they were about God. But in the midst of that, of all their rule following, they didn't know God's love. They never came home, and that's the intended audience for this message. When Jesus, or this story, Jesus is teaching them why he welcomes home the wayward, because they were accusing him of being too loose, too liberal, too forgiving, too gracious, and he's telling them this story because they wouldn't be welcoming the way Jesus was, and they weren't. Now, what about today? Who does this brother represent today? And I would venture to say it's good church-going folks. Those of us who are trying to earn God's approval by doing all kinds of good things and trying to keep our noses clean, that we're trying to work our way into God's good graces rather than accepting his free gift of love. That was something the older brother never did. He just never accepted the gift of his father's love. He always felt like he had to earn it. Now, those of us who are parents, we know it doesn't work that way. Your kids don't have to earn your love. You just give it to them. And in a sense, when they try to earn your love, it's almost like an offensive thing. You don't need to do that. You have my love. You have my heart already. And I wonder if maybe you might be identified with that person, with this brother. And maybe you're someone you've never strayed, you've never gone wild and reckless. Like this brother, you've always stayed kind of close to home. But in your heart, you've always been still distant from God and never close, never loved, never felt like the acceptance and the joy and the love of Jesus. So in our story, the father speaks to this older brother, and he encourages him to come in. He says, join the party, come on in. And he tells him, you could have had anything you want, like the inheritance. Your brother took it all. You could have had anything you want. It's been yours all along. So come on in and enjoy it. And I think of just how gracious is Jesus in telling this story. In one way, it's a rebuke to the self-righteous Pharisees who are looking down their nose. So it's kind of a rebuke to them, but at the same time, it's an invitation for them. So he's saying, come on in too. All are welcome to come home, for Christ has made a way through his death and his resurrection. Christ has made a way for all of us to come home in faith. I'd like to finish with a story, true story that was told many years ago by Billy Graham. And the story is about a man who was soon to get out of jail. He'd been in for maybe about 7 or 8 years. And about a week before he was getting out, he wrote a letter home. And he wrote to his wife and he said, I'm getting out in a week. And I know I've never been much of a father. I know I've been a terrible husband. I've did all kinds of things that I'm ashamed of. And he said, so next week when I get out, he said, I'm going to take the bus and it's going to run through town. And he says, if you want me to be a part of your life, he said, tie a yellow ribbon or yellow string around the mailbox. And when the bus comes by, I'll know you want me to stay and want me to come home. And I'll tell the bus driver to pull over. He says, he goes, if you don't want me to, he said, just don't put anything out. And he said, and the bus will go by, you'll never know. And he says, and if that's what you do, he says, I don't blame you. I will stay out of your life forever. You'll never have to worry about me again. Well, sure enough, a week later, this gentleman gets out of jail and he hops on the bus. And as he's traveling home, the bus stops by a college and a bunch of college students get on. And as they're journeying towards this man's hometown, he shares this story with them. And then as they're getting closer to the town, the whole bus is wondering. They're all anxious, like, what's going to happen when we turn the corner and head down Main Street where this man lives? Well, the moment came. The bus entered town. It turned the corner. And what they saw was not yellow ribbon on the mailbox. What they saw was the whole street decked out in yellow. There were blankets and towels and sheets and ribbons and anything that was yellow, and it was covered all over the street. And when the bus got in front of the man's house, there was his wife and his children ready to receive him. I want to tell you a very important truth, that today all of heaven is decked out in yellow for you, to receive you by faith in Jesus Christ, regardless of who you are, regardless of what you've done. Jesus has made a way home for you. When we get to the end of the story, it doesn't have a conclusion. It's left open-ended. And that's a choice that God gives all of us. Again, remember, there's no locks on his doors. The question is, will you come in? Will you come home?